The Association of Southeast Asian Nations had its latest summit, and as expected, there were no fireworks, or kind of. On one hand, there was some drama. President Marcos Jr. pushed back against claims by the Chinese premier that the situation in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea is generally stable. President Marcos Jr. made it clear that the reality is far from that, and that smaller countries like the Philippines are not going to compromise on their sovereign rights based on international law. And then there were also claims, at least by the United States, that China and Russia were blocking certain statements and consensus building with ASEAN in the East Asia Summit, which composes ASEAN nations and major powers in the region. But beyond those expected diplomatic tit for tat, or a little bit of drama, there wasn't much that was achieved by the ASEAN, at least on the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea issue, not to mention the brewing, festering, and tragic civil war in Myanmar, an ASEAN member. So, what's going on with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations? Why has it been so ineffective in addressing regional disputes, especially in the South China Sea? Is the consensus based decision making approach really optimal for ASEAN? And why is the Philippines seemingly so lonely or suffering from strategic solitude within the region? Or is it that the Philippines is just more vocal and courageous with pushing back against bullying? In order to understand that, we have a special guest. Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Rahman Yaqub. There's a lot that we want to discuss about the ASEAN region and all. First of all, what is your understanding of the Philippines? I mean, you come from the Lowy Institute in Australia, down under, and the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., gave an address there, and then later on, also, of course, at the Australian Parliament. What is your read? I know you're going to be nice and diplomatic, but what is your objective scholarly understanding?
Yeah, I
What
mean,
was the reception, and what do you think was it signaling? Yeah.
thank you very much for having me here. What I would say is that, look, I pity the Philippines. You guys are in a very difficult position here, and you are facing the brunt of the Chinese military might in the South China Sea. And I think because ASEAN per se is not providing that kind of support to the Philippines, and I think from my observations, the Philippines is trying to broaden its defense relations with the Quad members, for example, Australia, India, Japan, beside the US. So I think that's why President Marcos went over to Australia to explain the Philippines' positions, why you need to take a certain stance, certain positions in the South China Sea. Of course, there is a strategic convergence between the Philippines and Australia. Australia, 99% of its export and imports are seaborne. Most of its jet fuels have to be sent over through the maritime domain. So there is a sense that within Australia, the South China Sea needs to be stable, need to be secured, and it's actually converged with the strategic interests of the Philippines. And I think that's why Australia and the Philippines are working closely to make sure the South China Sea is stable. Uh, in the case of ASEAN per se, I think as we have noticed that there's a bit of lack of support from ASEAN on the Philippines' position in the South China Sea. And I think we can try to look at it further in this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it was more. I wanted to get your perspective and your understanding of how was the room responding to, because I remember back in 2017 when you had the inaugural Australia ASEAN summit, I had the unfortunate privilege of explaining why my president back then, Rodrigo Duterte, was not
Yeah,
in attendance, and the Philippines back then was the outlier
yeah,
as a country that had a very anti-Western, at least openly anti-Western
yeah,
leader, cussing at the American president earlier,
yeah,
refusing to go to any Western capital. And here we go. Now suddenly you have another president, well, quite a known commodity as far as the name, or some would say notoriety, is
yeah,
concerned. He loves the West. He
yeah,
seems very at home in the West.
yeah.
So was there an understanding among Australians strategically that the Philippines is back into mold, or that this is going to be a kind of a different and even more interesting Philippines? What was your read of that?
Well, I think they look at the Philippines under the new Marcos administration as, back to normal, back to business. Hopefully, Duterte is once off a blip in Philippines West relations. And I think President Marcos, to be fair, if you look at the broader
Right.
for Philippines foreign policy, he tried to make good relations with the Chinese. The first country that he
Right.
visited was China.
Just like Duterte, right?
Yeah, but something happened after that. So from what I understand is that he came back. Something happened in the South China Sea. The Philippines tried to contact the Chinese counterpart through the various hotline. The Chinese were not picking up.
Mm.
President Marcos asked, "What's going on? Why the Chinese are not picking up the hotline? They have assured me that things would be okay, everything would be stable." So my suspicion is that the incidents after the visits to China actually shaped the President Marcos' perceptions of
Mm.
the South China Sea and its relation with Beijing, and then it requires or it makes him to review everything, and then maybe the best option is okay, we are not getting much economic benefits from China in the first place, and the Chinese are coming down hard on us in the South China Sea. What is the alternative option? America is your traditional ally. Australia, Japan, India have a similar interest in the stability of the South China Sea. So maybe let's work with all these external partner.
Mm.
I'm quite impressed with in terms of President Marcos' efforts to advance Philippines' interest in the South China Sea. In fact, when I spoke to quite a number
Mm.
of Filipino officials, they say that President Marcos actually is one of the very few presidents that actually is pushing forward, try to advance Philippine interests in the South China Sea dispute.
Right. I mean, although of course some, and of course some will also add that it's also what did not happen during that visit to China. I think he was expecting some
Yeah.
concrete and tangible assurances on the South China Sea front, some concrete investment follow through, because a lot of
Mm.
investments that were promised back in the day during Duterte days, the
Yeah.
heydays, the halcyon days, didn't really materialize. So I think pragmatically, Marcos realized these guys are not taking us seriously. So we have to have leverage, and what better leverage than fortifying our traditional alliances and all of that. Um, I'll go back to the Philippines, but can we zoom out a little bit, because you're now in this privileged position of being an Australian and at the same time a Singaporean and also an ASEANist, right?
Yeah.
And now you're here in Manila and welcome here. Can we go through the key players in the region first? First of all, what is your understanding of different claimant states here? For instance, um, Vietnam and Malaysia. Is there a
Mm.
difference between how Vietnam and Malaysia approach the South China Sea issue or the China threat?
I
If,
think,
if, if they even believe there's a threat, yeah.
yeah, I mean, based on your question, I'm a Singaporean and working in Australia. I'm a bit of bipolar. That's what I told the conference. I have a bipolar experience. So, from the Southeast Asian perspective, and of course the Australian perspective, we look at the different claimants. They have different ways of dealing with the Chinese claims in the South China Sea. In the case of Malaysia, they prefer quiet diplomacy.
Mm.
Uh, I think there's a few reasons. One, the Malaysians rely quite a fair bit on the Chinese to support them economically. Second, their military forces is quite small. Uh, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about two-thirds of their warships were commissioned about 30 years ago, and they have
Mm.
a problems to send out their warships to patrol their EEZ. So, and the third one, unlike the Philippines, they don't have any military allies,
Yeah.
so they are on their own. And these are all the different calculations the Malaysian leaderships have to consider when it looks at the South China Sea dispute. Having said that, to my understanding and based on my conversations with senior Malaysian defense officials, each time the Chinese are trying to do something within the Malaysian EEZ, they will push back hard at the diplomatic level. Yeah. Vietnam, on the other hand,
So so sorry,
yeah.
just in Malaysia first, right?
Okay.
So it's quiet but firm, right? So
Yes.
when there were incidents of China piercing into their airspace, the defense minister of Malaysia said something. They were very firm when they
Yeah.
pushed for the the Vescapella Petronas oil
Yeah.
exploration during the pandemic period, and they
Yeah.
held their ground.
Yeah.
So I think there's this misperception that Malaysia's quiet diplomacy is actually passive or submissive. But when I look at the facts on the ground, it's not. In 2019, I remember
Mhm.
I was in Hainan
Yeah.
in China. We had this conference right after the Shandong aircraft carrier was launched. Our Chinese friends were very happy and proud. But suddenly they were asking me, "Why is Malaysia doing this? I thought we're good friends, and now they're
Yeah.
filing an extended continental shelf claim at the United Nations."
Yeah.
And this is when Mahathir was there, who was speaking from different sides of his mouth. Right,
Yeah.
very interesting dynamic. So So what's going on really there in Malaysia, and to what degree is the domestic politics and also the economics of relations with China influencing it? Because they're the biggest trading partner of China, and China has
Yeah.
huge investments there, debt trap or not.
Mm.
Unlike, let's say, in the Philippines, for instance. How is that influencing also the positioning of their leaderships?
I think they are playing a games of diplomacy and deterrence. I would say that.
Mm.
Okay. Anwar Ibrahim, he has passed a few comments. Look, China is not a security concern. It's not a threat.
In Australia, especially, yeah, during the
Yeah.
ASEAN Australia summit, yeah.
So I think that is the diplomatic part of it. Try to tell the Chinese, look, I'm looking at you, from a positive angle. So maybe there's something that we can work on. But on the military part, there's a bit of military build up in the state of Sarawak. They are looking at building new naval and air base capacity. So on the quiet front, they say, okay, look, let's work on something. Let's build up our military capabilities as soon as possible. Uh, I think this is the game the Malaysians are playing well.
Mm.
The good thing is that it is putting the Chinese in a state of being unbalanced. Like, how do we read the Malaysians? Are they very
Mm.
friendly to us? And why are they building up their military capabilities? On the other hand, if you can remember, the Malaysians actually conducted a joint military exercise with the Americans and Australia in Sarawak, in
Right.
Sabah, I think in eastern Malaysia. So it demonstrates their concerns about China. Uh, to be fair, when I spoke to one of the senior military officials in Malaysia, he
Mm.
told me that China is still the number one security concerns of Malaysia.
Right.
Yeah, but we will have to balance it with other interests for now.
So it's really more of a subtle diplomacy than quiet diplomacy. My understanding is they also play this very interesting game. Or actually, I won't say it's a game. I think it's quite genuine. There's a dimension of also anti-Western sentiment as a Muslim majority country
Yeah,
on issues concerning Israel and
mm,
Palestine
yeah,
conflict, which obviously has entered a new phase
mm,
with what's happening in Gaza.
yeah,
Can you tell me a little bit about how that could also impact? Because I think Lynn Cook had this
mm,
great piece in Foreign Affairs
yeah,
recently, and I think there's a quote supposedly there about the Malaysian officials saying, because of Gaza, we're going to be with China or something like, we're so disappointed with the West's
yeah,
double standards or supposed double standards
yeah,
and unconditional support for Israel in light of all of these perceived violations of international law that, China is now at this China
yeah.
position itself. So how is that the Israel Palestine conflict and the broader Islamic sensibilities playing into this?
Yeah, I think the Anwar Ibrahim government has to cater to the growing Islamic or Muslim interests in Malaysia.
Right.
So if you look at the pattern of the last general election that they had, quite a fair bit of the northern part of Malaysia has fallen into the hands of the PAS, the
Right.
Islamic Party.
Islamic Party, yeah.
Yeah. But again, this is very interesting. So I was following the Anwar Ibrahim positions on the Gaza crisis, for
Right.
example. He did announce that, okay, why don't we have not a conference, a gathering of Malaysians expressing their unhappiness about what's going on in Gaza. He said, okay, you can bring your banner, whatever it is. And then when the next day, when I was following the
Mm-hmm.
updates on Twitter, I noticed a few Malaysians were complaining about the what I call it, the gathering. They said, look, we are bringing the play cards condemning, criticizing the Israelis. Most of them were confiscated by the police.
Interesting.
Yeah. So from what I understand from some of my sources,
Right.
Anwar has to play this role of, like, I'm an Islamist, I'm a Muslim, let's fight
To
for
keep at
Gaza,
bay
right?
the past and the Islamists, to say I'm
Yeah.
more Islamist than you, but at the same time he wants to be that international statesman dealing with the West.
Yes. So it's very difficult positions for a Muslim majority
Yeah.
country. Yeah. So I pity Anwar. I don't want to be in his position actually. Yeah.
That's why I said we have to perhaps talk about the domestic politics. In fact, one of the things I
Uh,
find interesting, the last time I was in Putrajaya last year, I remember Anwar had just returned from Beijing and he
yeah.
was offered more than $30 billion and all of that. And he was being really lambasted by members of the old guard. People who
Yeah.
used to be with, the people who were so close to China
Yeah.
back in the day, now criticizing him
Mhm.
for not insisting on Malaysia's sovereign rights and for being open to
Yeah.
joint development exploration. So there's also that kind of, I won't say cynical, but run of the mill domestic politics of using the China card to
Yes.
posture, right?
Yeah. I agree with you. If you remember when AUKUS was actually first announced
Good
back
point.
then,
Yeah.
we have the I think then Defense Minister Hishamuddin said that, look, I think we need to talk to China. We need to consult China. At the time, Anwar Ibrahim was in the opposition party.
Right.
He flagged it up. He said, why do you need to consult China? I mean, this is
Right.
AUKUS. This is, the Australia defense policy per se. So why, as a Malaysian, why do we need to consult China as though we are subservient? So if you look at the domestic politics of
Yeah.
Malaysia, a lot of it has an impact on how they act, how they behave with China, with the US. Uh, to be fair, the Malaysian senior defense officers keep telling me, look, we prefer to have the Americans here
Right.
because the Americans are the only one that can counter China. But
Exactly. Yeah.
they can't say it publicly. I'll give you another example. In 1991, when Singapore first announced that it will allow American forces to use Singapore's military facilities, the Indonesians and the Malaysians were making a lot of noise then until Singapore's I think Prime Minister then, or maybe Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew, had to talk to Suharto and Mahathir. But in 2019, when Singapore signed the extensions of that agreement with the Americans, the Malaysians and Indonesians were quiet.
Right.
So if you look at it, look, it's a signal that, look, these two countries actually, they want the Americans to be here, but they can't say it out loud.
So there's a lot of performativity there, I would say, and also a certain degree of messaging and opportunism. So, for instance, the siding supposedly with China on AUKUS was not too long after the tensions with China over the oil exploration one. And sometimes I feel, bashing the West or West-leaning countries like the Philippines supposedly is perhaps their way of giving, some concessions to China, or at least some consolation, if I can put it that way. Now, let's talk about Indonesia, the far larger Muslim majority country,
Yes.
who is not a direct claimant. We'll go to Vietnam, don't worry. It's not a direct claimant in the South China Sea, but because of the ambiguities of the Nine-Dash Line,
Yeah.
it kind of overlaps with the Natuna Sea area. So
Yes.
much so that the Indonesians had to rename the area as North Natuna Sea. And of course, a few years earlier, former President Jokowi, had to go there and draw the line and say no compromise whatsoever.
Yeah.
Where is Indonesia coming? What is the difference between Indonesia and Malaysia, aside from the obvious fact that it's obviously not a direct claimant states from the South China Sea, but nevertheless
Yeah.
concerned about this?
So I think in the case of Indonesia, especially under the Jokowi administration, the main focus is on economic development, infrastructural development.
Right.
Less think about defense policy, foreign policy per se. So
Very developed mayor governor mindset.
Yes.
Yeah.
So most of the foreign policy initiative or engagements were left solely to Retno Marsudi, for example. But the incoming president-elect actually, Prabowo, is a bit of different game. So
Yes.
he has
And he was here in Manila not long ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's quite interested about foreign policy. He wants to bring Indonesia to engage the world. So I'm not sure where he will take Indonesia to vis-a-vis the South China Sea dispute. But from my understanding and from my engagement with Indonesian officials, I think that he may be impatient with ASEAN, like why things are slow.
Right.
The code of conduct negotiation, how many years has it been going
Decades,
through?
actually.
Yeah, or decades, yeah. But if you look beyond the COC per se, which started in 2002 or 2004,
Yeah.
ASEAN engagement with China on the South China Sea have actually commenced in 1990. It was Indonesia that actually launched the workshop to de-escalate the tension there in 1990.
Yeah.
But 34 years of negotiations was going on. Yeah. And when I spoke to many ASEAN officials, I think quite a number of them are looking at Indonesia now. Can Indonesia,
Yes.
under Prabowo, play a more significant role in the South China Sea dispute, in the Myanmar crisis, things like that? And of course, because Indonesia is the largest country in ASEAN,
The big brother,
Big
supposedly.
brother.
Yeah.
the natural leaders of ASEAN. And I think that's where we are hoping more initiative to come up from Indonesia.
Let's talk about Prabowo a little bit. Interesting guy, right? So, I actually argued in a number of pieces that I suspect he had the same campaign team as Marcos Jr. Scion of strongman
Yeah.
regime, and then suddenly this kind of avuncular and very relatable and Gen Z hit
Mm.
both Marcos Jr. and
Yeah.
Prabowo, and I was not surprised with the bonhomie and the kind of lightheartedness that they had when they met each other. But the important thing with both of them at some point were
Yeah.
pariahs in the
Yeah.
West,
Yeah.
even more so in the case of Prabowo, because of his alleged involvement in human rights violation. For a
Yeah.
time, he couldn't visit the West.
Yes.
And
Right.
my understanding was that when he visited the West not long ago, as a defense minister, he went on, kind of essentially rambling and ranting about how he was mistreated and all of that. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. This is a man with a sense of mission. This is a man with a sense that Indonesia is not just a small time country. He
Yeah.
speaks English. I think he was educated in the UK, Sandhurst.
Yeah.
So he's very adept at the Western culture, just like our president, Marcos Jr., who was also a
Yeah.
UK educated person. To what degree do you think that will make Indonesia less pliant, or at least willing to draw the line with China? We're already seeing, for instance, Indonesia imposing tariffs on Chinese imports, feeling,
Yeah.
hey, you cannot just have your way here.
Mm.
And Indonesia at the same time playing a harder stance on greater industrial policy, making sure they're
Yeah.
not just an extractive industry. So in short, this is not just a big brother of ASEAN. This is a G20 member that could be a G5 member, could be among five largest economies down the road.
Yeah.
What is that kind of great power sense in Indonesia? What about that?
Yeah.
How does that speak to you? Yeah.
I think Indonesia have a grand visions. I think one of them is a Vision 2045 that they want to be somewhere in the global international order. Uh, Australians recognize that actually, and
Yeah.
that's why the Australian government have stepped up engagement with the Indonesians, because Indonesia will be the number 4, number 5 economy in the world soon.
Yeah.
So it is quite better for us to have a good relations with an upcoming power. Uh, with regards to the South China Sea, and I think this is where I will be a bit controversial here, if you don't mind.
Please.
Um, 2 years or okay, in 2021, there was a defense document that Prabowo put up when he was when he's 2 years after he was appointed as a defense minister. And when I look at the documents, he mentioned about the loss of Timor Leste because of foreign military intervention.
Australian, especially.
It didn't
yeah.
Australia was not mentioned, but we know who what it
Yeah.
was. But that document also mentioned about bases, military bases of the Indonesian armed forces that will be modernized with modern equipment, long-range radar, coastal radar system, and long-range camera. And I map out these bases.
Mhm.
80% of it are away from the South China Sea. They are facing Guam and Australia. So I think there is still concerns in Prabowo that the American forces in Darwin may move in and intervene and take over West Papua away from Indonesia. So I'm not sure to what extent this psyche is strong within the Indonesian establishment, but through my conversation with
Interesting.
many Indonesian officials, they said there's still that trauma of losing Timor-Leste. And of course, it was because of foreign military interventions by a Western power. Yeah.
So there's a psychic wound there. But
Yeah.
but it looks like Australia is conscious of that and is very deftly approaching and trying to rebuild and strengthen. How is the Indonesian now speak as an Australian?
Yeah.
How is the Canberra Jakarta strategic cooperation going?
Yes, I think the Australians are keen to develop closer defense relations with Indonesia. The Australians have actually signed
Yeah.
defense cooperation pact with Indonesia, but and then that's where things diverge. The Australians were very keen, interested, and the publicity was quite good. From the Indonesian perspective, it is just one of a defense agreement we are having with many countries. It's normal.
Nothing special.
Nothing special. And to what I understand from some officials, they were not happy about the press coverage that was given as though it was Australian and Indonesians were having a kind of a defense pact. The word pact means something like NATO pact or Warsaw
Right.
pact. They said this is just a normal agreement to confirm what we have already done before. Nothing
Right.
special. And if you notice, a few days after Prabowo visited Australia, the Indonesian army chief announced that Indonesia is planning to organize a military exercise with China. Yeah, so it caught many by surprise. Again, when I talked to officials there, like, what's going on? They said, look, this is a bebas and active, free and active policy that we're trying to demonstrate to the world. We are not, just because we sign a defense pact with Australia doesn't mean we will move into the Western orbit or we will align ourselves with the Americans. I think in Indonesia or among the Indonesians, there is this pride about we are neutral, we are the big brothers of ASEAN, and we want to stay as neutral or non-aligned. We don't want to be controlled or influenced by any major powers.
That's interesting. I mean, if you want to talk about history, there was also a time where, for decades, there was no relationship between PRC and Jakarta, right, during the New
Yes.
Order. And of course, we had the, some would say, ethnic cleansing,
Yeah.
massive massacres of a lot of supposedly communists, and a lot of them also, Chinese minority
Yeah.
folks in Indonesia. A horrific period, in this mid '60s all the way to the '70s. How can that aspect come into light, that part of the psychic wound, let's just put it
Yeah.
in repressed psychic wound, even in Indonesian political mindset. What would it take for that part to come back? I mean, it's quite a dark side, I would say, to Indonesian politics, that
Yeah.
it's you still have to tiptoe around, from
Yeah.
my understanding nowadays, whenever I'm in Jakarta. But what would it take from China? I mean, if China does something aggressive in the South China, some military maneuvers,
Okay.
do you think that could affect that relationship, in all sense, bring back also that trauma?
Well, I think very interesting
That's
question though.
that's an intense issue, actually. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But I had to ask it because
Okay.
you talk about psychic wounds.
This is where Taiwan's coming. Yeah.
Mm,
So, uh, if China were to launch a military
right.
campaigns against Taiwan, Indonesia have about between 300 to 400,000 workers in Taiwan.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when this is what again, when I talk to the Indonesians, what may happen in Indonesia in a military campaigns between China and Taiwan, said, look, we have about a few hundred thousand workers there. If a Chinese missile accidentally kill
Indonesia,
100 Indonesian worker, we may have racial riots in Indonesia.
like the 1990s after the
Yeah.
Asian financial crisis. Yeah.
So the Indonesian may not care about whether is it a local Indonesian Chinese or Chinese from China or
Right.
Chinese from Singapore or Taiwan. They will. I mean, there might be an internal chaos there. So again, this is something that I would say a domestic
Yes.
stability having a link with an external, I would say, strategic situation. Yeah.
It is, right, because I remember the Malaysian ambassador to Kuala Lumpur a few years ago
Yeah.
said something about proper treatment of Chinese Malaysians or something like that. I'm not
Yes.
saying they're Russia level of
Mm.
invading countries based on the pretext of protecting Russian speaking people, but we're seeing a different version of China nowadays, right? A China that openly talks about the welfare of other Chinese people. And
Yeah.
I think, as good friends like Ambassador Kosik and Bilahari have mentioned,
Yeah.
there's that kind of a united front discourse now, if not mobilization.
Yeah.
This this blurring of distinction between PRC Chinese citizens and Chinese ethnic Chinese folks in Southeast Asia, right?
Yeah.
Now let's talk about Vietnam, because this is where, speaking of
Mm.
violence against people of Chinese descent or perceived Chinese,
Yeah.
this was the case a few years ago,
Yes.
right? When there was an
Correct.
incident in South China Sea, next thing you know, it looks like a spontaneous explosion of anti-China sentiments,
Mm.
so much so that even Taiwanese were affected because
Yeah.
they were
Correct.
they were mistaken as PRC folks.
Mm.
And I think that shocked both China and also the Vietnamese government. But I understand that Vietnam over the past 2 or 3 years has been going through a lot of political transitions. I've been visiting Vietnam very regularly because of
Yeah.
the South China Sea issue and our consultations on arbitration case,
Mm.
among other things. So my understanding is Vietnam is now very economically interdependent, if not dependent on China, and also the domestic political upheavals
Yeah.
perhaps may explain things. But nevertheless, Vietnam has been the most consistently assertive claimant
Yeah.
vis-a-vis China in the
Yeah.
South China Sea.
Yeah.
Where do you see that going in the coming years?
I think the Vietnamese have a dual track policy,
Mm,
deterrence and diplomacy. So, in the sense that when they need to, they will send their boats to confront the Chinese aggressively. And I think this is what a Vietnamese official shared with me before. When
right.
there's a Chinese ship there, we will send our ships. If we need to ram against the Chinese ship, we will do it if there's a need to. But at the end of the day, they also recognize that diplomacy needs to play a role. So, to my
And party
understanding,
to party ties.
yes,
Communist
both of
party.
them are
Yeah,
communist
yeah,
brothers, actually. Yeah, but
yeah.
at the end of the day, they realize that look, I think the Chinese to some extent responds to certain diplomatic move.
Mm,
So in 2014, the incidents that you mentioned, to my understanding, there were about 35 meetings between the Vietnamese and the Chinese in a matter of 1 month.
yeah.
Yeah, that is at the diplomatic front. But on the ground, the Vietnamese continue to send their Coast Guard vessels to hit against the Chinese vessels. So I think the Chinese, looking at the calculation, looking at how hard the Vietnamese are standing up against the
Yeah.
Chinese, and of course party to party relations, things like that. They say, okay, I think maybe we should de-escalate. Yeah. So again, I think if you want to apply the Philippine case to the Vietnamese, it's a bit difficult. There's a
Very
lot of
different.
different context there. The Philippines, unless of course the Philippines we have a Philippines Communist Party in Manila, then maybe you can have a
Well, I mean,
party to
Duterte
party
came
talk.
close to something along those lines, special friend. No, but
Yeah,
of course, geography. They are, they have borders, direct borders with China. That gives us a
yeah,
variety that the Philippines has not had to confront, right?
yeah,
But at the same time, they don't have a U.S. treaty alliance, so they
yes,
can claim to be independent. No one can question them as being a lackey. I mean,
yeah,
you would look like a fool if you try to portray them as that. So that gives them some sort of flexibility on that front. But my sense is everyone talks about Philippines standing up to China, but actually historically it's the Vietnamese who are the most strident
yeah,
on this front. Now let's talk about Singapore, your beloved country. Singapore is an interesting case because it has very vibrant diplomatic and economic relationship with
yeah,
China. There's
mm,
the fact that, of course, Lee
yeah,
Kuan Yew was revered by China after his passing. Huge praise for him and all.
yeah,
At the same time, it has a very solid relationship with the United States on the security front.
yeah.
So, what is Singapore's game? What is the Singaporean hedging strategy, if I can put it that way, when it comes to not only South China Sea but also, bridging between these two superpowers?
Yeah, I think Singapore position is quite has been consistent with since the Cold War. Its position is that look, we should have as many major powers in the region because
Mm.
if there is one dominant major power, Lee Kuan Yew has already mentioned about it, like big fish will eat small
And
fish will
yeah, poison
feed,
shrimp.
swim.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if the Americans or any other Western power pull out from the region, what will be the Chinese action? So I think that's the reason why the Singaporean government's consistently working on to have the Americans anchor in this region, in this part of the world. And when the Americans pull out from Subic Bay and Clark Air
They went to
Base,
Singapore. Yeah,
yeah, Singapore said, look, we will offer
logistics and
you.
all. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that is one of the strategy that Singapore is adopting. Uh, with regards to the South China Sea, I think a few years ago, Singapore Defense Minister have hinted that, look, we are concerned because Singapore is a trading hub,
Right.
maritime hub. Anything happens in the South China Sea, Singapore will be affected. Of course, to some extent, Singapore paid a price. Was it like a few years ago?
Confiscated
Yeah,
your combat.
our armor vehicle
Yeah.
was confiscated. According to
Was
the
that on the
Chinese,
way back from Taiwan exercises? I mean,
yes,
that's speaking of Taiwan. Singapore and Taiwan have an interesting defense relationship, right?
yes,
Which no one talks about, but actually it's very vital.
yeah. Since the 1970s, mid 1970s, Singapore is a small island, no space for the armed
Mm,
forces to conduct military
so they
exercises.
go to Taiwan, yeah.
Yeah, and the Taiwanese government offered that. So why don't you train with us at our area? So Singapore took up the offer. I think it's a bit of balancing act.
Interesting.
We don't have a diplomatic relation with China, with Taiwan. We recognize one China policy, but we have military forces in Taiwan.
Now I want to zoom out a little bit towards the
Yeah,
latter part of our discussion. So this is what I really want to do. Obviously it will take a whole semester to teach which is what I'm doing right now, and I have a book actually with folks in Melbourne University on
uh,
this different case studies. So I really enjoyed
yeah,
this, Dr. Yaqub. Um, let's zoom out a little bit. I mean, people talk about ASEAN as a kind of a, it's like we're like the pawns on the chessboard of America and China. So I think first of all, that's a denial of our strategic agency. My
yeah,
goodness, Indonesia is already going to be one of the biggest economies in the world.
yeah,
Singapore is an amazingly progressive country, and the Philippines and Vietnam are becoming middle powers, if not
yes.
middle powers, and or already there.
You guys are really middle power,
Yeah,
according to the Low
according to you
Institute.
guys, yeah,
Yeah,
thanks to Low Institute, I've been vindicated that we're middle powers.
yeah,
Everyone said, no, you don't believe me? Look at the Low Institute, right? But going back to this, but it's not like China and US are the only players here. Like India is the next big thing, if not already
yeah,
the big thing. What is your understanding of how India could shape the dynamics of great power competition in this part of the world and actually empower and help us? I mean, the Philippines, we
yeah.
feel that we got the BrahMos missile system from there.
Mm,
They even use the word West Philippine Sea for the parts that we claim as our exclusive
yeah.
economic zone. Jai Shankar, Dr. Jai Shankar was here not long ago.
Yeah.
Really warm relationship with India nowadays
Mm.
and Manila. Yeah.
So Within the Southeast Asian regions, there are countries that are not comfortable to work with the Americans openly.
Mm.
And that's where middle power like India, Australia, Japan can play a significant role. Uh, I give you one example. There is this database that will allow Southeast Asian country to monitor their maritime domain. It's called a Sea Vision. So the
Right.
Americans say, look, we can allow you to have access to the database so that you can monitor what's going on in within your EEZ. So certain ASEAN country, the intelligence agency said, look, I don't think we want to use it because we may be perceived to be siding with the Americans against the Chinese. So on the other hand, if another country like India, Australia, or Japan offered military assistance
Yeah.
or intelligence assistance, they said, oh, we are quite open to it because no, these are middle power.
Right.
We are not
It's more
taking the side.
politically correct.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
that's
more PC. Yeah.
so I think there's a lot of opportunities and potentials for middle power like India, Japan, South Korea, and Australia to play, to contribute to Southeast Asian security and stability.
And what about Japan? I've described Japan as a stealth superpower in the sense that obviously, Japan, the pacifist constitution,
Mm.
shrinking population, it has many challenges. But I never counted out Japan. I remember I was there in
Yeah.
January. I had multiple visits to Japan this year, but in January, we had meetings with foreign ministry, with defense ministry, the prime minister's office, etc. And there was a lot of sense of panic and dread. We met some of the top advisors of the late Abe administration, and then within weeks they launched this semiconductor strategy, and
Yeah.
boom, now they completely are dominating the next phase of the Taiwanese are coming in, the Koreans are coming, the
Yeah.
Americans are invested. So I never discounted the Japanese, who are still top four economies in the world, slightly behind Germany right now.
Yeah.
And in the Philippines, there are even people are saying that actually Japan is even more complete partner to us than the United States,
Yeah.
because the US is a big military partner,
Mhm.
but they don't have much of new investments. I mean, you go across Manila where the American build infrastructure, but I
Yeah.
can show you many Japanese build infrastructure, including subways that are being built
Yeah.
below our feet. And we just signed the reciprocal access agreement.
Yeah.
What about Japan? Because unlike India, I would say China and Japan have some dynamics, some enmity
Yeah.
there, and it's not
Yeah.
like Japan is not a U.S. treaty ally.
Yeah.
India can always say I'm not a U.S. treaty ally, I'm my own guy. But
Yeah.
what about Japan? Is Japan PC in terms of, and in what sense? Because I also see an ICEA service when I'm sure
Yeah.
both of us are among many people being asked to
Yeah.
contribute. Japan always comes on top together with the European Union as
Yeah.
preferred external partners.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the Japan connection here?
I think it relies. It falls back on the Japan's economic relations with the region. It has been one of the largest investor during the Cold War period. In Singapore, we've seen Japanese companies setting up factories here, Malaysia, Indonesia. So I think since the Cold War period, 70s, 80s, Japan has been there in Southeast Asia, building up contribute to our economic stability, prosperity, and from that point onwards, I think there's a bit
Mm.
of trust level between the Southeast Asian country and Japan is a staying power. So, and of course, because there's again a strategic convergence between some ASEAN country and Japan,
Mm.
stability of the sea line of communications. Japan imports most of its energy through the maritime domain. Similarly, again, Southeast Asian country love or prefer to have a stable South China Sea and Strait of Malacca. So again, this strategic convergence and a high level of trust with the Japanese really helps to contribute a stronger ASEAN's or Southeast Asians relations with Japan. And Japan, for example, has provided quite a fair bit of military law enforcement assistance to ASEAN country.
Yeah.
We
Uh,
provided some Coast Guard ships or vessels to the
we proudly have
Philippines,
one of the best coast guards in the region, thanks to
yeah,
Japan. Yeah.
to Malaysia, to
Vietnam.
Indonesia, Vietnam. So again, assistance by the Japanese are well received. But again, when you go back to a major power, like the Americans, so when the Americans wanted to offer something to certain Southeast Asian country in terms of equipment, they would say, okay, let's take a step back. Are we going to be seen by China as taking the side of the Americans against the Chinese? Second, can we trust the American equipment? Because if you look at the case of Indonesia, when the Americans and the Indonesians have a bit of a problem in the 1990s because of Timor Leste, the Americans launch an arm embargo against Indonesia.
Mm.
And again, this falls back on the how the US treated Southeast Asian country in the past. So the regions look at history,
Right.
and history actually plays a significant role in how they launch or how they execute their defense policy, defense strategy, and foreign policy. And that's the advice I always tell the Americans and the Westerners. You may not be interested in history, you think history is a waste of time, but Southeast Asian countries look at history.
Yes, although the Vietnamese will also talk about their history of 1,000 years of struggle with China. So
Yeah,
it's interesting which part of history you want to pick, right? I mean, in the
yeah,
Philippines, we had the misfortune of being colonized by multiple Western powers,
yeah,
both Spain and US. So choose which one you want to bash at this
yeah.
point, right? To justify your way forward. Before I go to the last part of this discussion, because I want to talk about this, what they call them, ASEAN organization,
Okay,
right?
yeah,
I
yeah.
think I put myself in too much trouble. Although I'm thankful Indonesia invited me to give a talk at the summit last year. Um, let's talk about Europe because the German, defense minister was here
Mhm.
recently in Manila, regional
Yeah.
tour. Farm Minister Sikorski was on this show from Poland. The Europeans are paying a lot of attention in this part of the world. What is your understanding of the role of Europe in this part of the world?
Again, 2 weeks ago, I was interviewed by a Norwegian media about South China Sea, and the first question that I asked is, "Why are you interested in South China Sea? I mean, you guys are there up there in the northern
Arctic,
Europe,
yeah,
Arctic."
yeah.
I said, "Look, there's a concern about the maritime domain, whether is it stable? Because if you look at it, I mean, the Europeans they have a trade link with South Korea, with Japan, with Taiwan. All these trade are done through the maritime domain. So any threats from China to the maritime domain is of a concern to them. So I think this is something that the Chinese don't understand. They Let me quote you one example. So I had an engagement with the Chinese officials. The first question that they asked me, because
Hmm.
I was representing Lowy Institute, they said, "Look, why is Australia interested about the South China Sea?
Mm.
It is too far away from Australia." So again, I mean, they don't understand why country that is located far away from
Yeah.
Asia have an interest there. But I think
Or they're implying you've been nudged by the Americans.
yeah.
Mm.
So I think the main thing is that look, there's a common interest in many countries all over the world about the stability and the security of the maritime domain because of economic lifeline, because of again food security, energy security. All these, the maritime domain plays a significant role. Yeah.
I mean, we realize with the Ukraine war, right, that we can all get affected and vice versa. From my own understanding, not only in Munich, but also in the Baltic states, among others, they always talk about how Taiwan could be the next Ukraine. And if we do well against Russia, that might deter China. So there's this nexus
Yeah.
between Europe and Asia that I think was not there for a long time. Last point, let's talk about ASEAN before I get bashed for
Okay.
here you go again, Richard. There are people in the Philippines, I would say, who feel we're being gaslighted by the rest of region for standing up to China, who feel that ASEAN is somewhere in between useless to enabler on the South China Sea. I know this is so undiplomatic. Um, and I understand where's the frustration coming from. And I'm saying
Yeah.
this as someone who loves the ASEAN. I spent time in different parts of the world, including in the Middle East. And I said
Yeah.
how I wish the Middle East had something like ASEAN
Yeah.
because they have a Game of Thrones situation down there,
Yes.
right? I hope they had something. So I love ASEAN. But, as we say in Espanol, cariño brutal, tough love.
Yeah.
Because I think ASEAN can do way better than this.
Mm.
So what's up with ASEAN? What do you think we should do in the coming years?
Richard, let me tell you something. You are the troublemaker in ASEAN. I mean, that's the common, some of the
That's the
perception,
narrative, yeah.
narrative. Yeah.
So troublemaker, that's the narrative. So how do you think we can get around that narrative? People in Philippines call ASEAN useless enablers of China. Folks on the other side say the Filipinos are troublemakers.
Yeah.
I don't know, deputy sheriff of US in ASEAN.
Yeah.
This is not helpful, right? So
Yeah.
what is a constructive way forward, Dr. Yakub?
I think the both ASEAN and Manila have to talk to each other more. Uh, from my perception, is that I think there is a lack of communications between the
Mm.
Philippines and the rest of ASEAN country. I think the Philippines have to explain why there is a change from the Marcos to from the Duterte administrations, why the Philippines are taking up certain measures against the Chinese. So again, I think we fall back on the earlier part of the conversations where I
Right.
mentioned about Marcos going over to China, and then when he returned back from China, something happens. So I think the other ASEAN countries need to understand why there is a change of what causes the change in the Manila strategy approach to China. Yeah. So again, without this understanding, we are just guessing. We said, okay, maybe Marcos decided that it's better to serve with the Americans, to work with the Americans closely, and then to ignore us, ASEAN. Put it this way, when Japan actually signed the defense agreement with the Philippines,
Yeah.
some ASEAN countries were not happy. They said, why you didn't consult us
A
in the
major
first place?
newspaper in Indonesia said something about it too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my question is, why should the Philippines actually consult the rest of ASEAN? Well, one way is to explain the Philippines' positions and to clarify it. Again, I go back to the 1991 incidents where Singapore announced that it's going to host American military facilities in
Mm.
Singapore.
Right.
Indonesia and Malaysia made plenty of noises then. Lee Kuan Yew and the government officials had to explain to the Malaysian and
Interesting.
Indonesian why we are doing that. So
Interesting.
it takes a bit of personal engagement at the leadership
Interesting.
level. Yeah. So I think maybe there is one way the Manila, the Philippines can consider to uh, to explain its positions, why it takes certain measure to the rest of ASEAN members. Of course, ASEAN is a bit complicated. Last year, when I was invited to brief a European defense minister about ASEAN, he has traveled through ASEAN, and then the first sentence he spoke to me, he said, "Look, uh, when I look at ASEAN, I don't understand it at all." So he asked me to explain about ASEAN. I said, "Oh, there's only one thing I can explain to you. ASEAN generally don't mean what it say. It don't say what it means,
Yeah.
and that's something you have to learn and read in between the lines." Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think at the very least we have to have that kind of procedural approach.
Mm.
Uh, but at the same time, I also understand if there are people are very skeptical and saying that this is just an excuse for us and not to help the Philippines. That no
Yeah.
matter what we do, damn if you don't. We went the Duterte way of being nice to China.
Yeah.
What did we get? And now we're standing up to China. We're being blamed for that. So I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of skepticism in the Philippines. Is it even worth it to
Yeah.
engage ASEAN? My personal stance
Yeah.
is okay. If from 1 to 10, you're gonna get 8 out of Japan, 9 out of US. Even if
Yeah.
you just get 2 out of ASEAN, that's better than zero.
Yes.
And more importantly, that makes it look less like you're with the West against China.
Yeah.
So I absolutely agree with you that the effort has to be made, regardless of how skeptical we are
Yeah.
about the receptiveness of some of our ASEAN partners
Yeah.
to the position of the Philippines and legitimate interests of the Philippines. Thank you so much. We went complete full circle, almost exact full circle.
Yeah.
We ended where we started. Thank you very much, Dr. Yakub, for that
Thank you.
fantastic discussion and overview of the region. So I'm sure that folks from the strategic community, if they want a 101 free workshop, they can just watch this discussion about
I'll watch your
ASEAN.
video.
Thank you so much. That was great. Catch
Yeah.
us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcast. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that was the view from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.